Last August we had an earthquake. Everybody knows about this, all right? So earthquakes are really not terribly common around. Actually, that's not true. We do have earthquakes all the time, but big earthquakes, kind of really get our attention, are not really big in this part of the country. You go out west, in California, and I've worked in California and Hawaii and Alaska, and the 5.8 that we had here was like a nothing, man. That doesn't even wake people up in the morning in California. But here was a big deal, all right? So last August, we have this 5.8 that was centered out of Mineral, Virginia. And there's a little picture of the centroid of the earthquake and the damage, or at least the area that of most extreme concern. And of course, most of it was in the area right around where the earthquake occurred. But some of it reached up our way, and not a lot. It wasn't the kind of thing that, fortunately, was not the kind of thing that caused a tremendous amount of damage. So when we look at what happened, by and large, in the DC, Baltimore area, damage was, generally speaking, reasonably modest to light. And I found this picture and I thought it was perfect. That's pretty much the way most of the damage was in this area. I saw this and I said, I gotta use this, because it really, it was the kind of event, and everybody sat through it. We all kind of went ooh, and most of it thought, well, we had a good time back in the '60s, and it kind of reminded me of that, but it was a different thing, right? Well, it did have some rather severe impact on a couple of structures that most of us are pretty familiar with, and that is the Washington Monument and the National Cathedral in Washington. And I also know there was some structural damage in Baltimore, of course. But really, what happens is those structures that were fairly large, fairly tall, a harmonic got set up. And if it was a small building, it was low to the ground, you didn't see much damage. But those, like the Washington Monument and the National Cathedral, experienced what you wouldn't consider it to be monstrous damage. I mean, certainly with the cathedral, there was some stuff that fell off here at the top, but this stuff is not terribly structurally sound. But in the Washington Monument, we saw these rather significant cracks, and I've been up inside here, and I mean, you can see daylight just kind of pointing through there. So obviously, the Washington Monument and other structures in the National Mall they're a part of our history. They're a part of our culture, and these are really, really important structures to us. So as a function of this, the National Park Service called us and said, hey, we want to know what's going on. They're collecting a tremendous amount of information, not just the leveling that we did, but the National Park Service is involved in quite a number of different programs to monitor the structural stress and strain on a lot of these structures in there. And you got to remember that virtually everything in the Washington Mall, you don't think of it this way. We've all been down to the Washington Monument. It kind of sits on a nice little hill. You sort of think that that's natural. It's all man-made. Everything basically from just a little bit east of the Washington Monument, east meaning towards the Capitol, virtually everything east of the Capitol, the Washington Monument westward is all sitting on fill. It's gravel and sand and clay. And the little mound that the Washington Monument sits on, that's all man-made. So all of that area in there has been filled in. Most people never think about it because we've never seen it. But if you get a book like Silvio Bedini's book on the Jefferson Stone, and Silvio's got a beautiful picture in there of the Jefferson Pier, which is was supposed to be the original meridian stone of the United States, and it looks up towards the White House, and you can see Tiber Creek right in between there. It's where the barges would tie up, right there at the Washington Monument. So all of that stuff westward is sitting on fill. And what happens in a fill area like that, when you have an earthquake, is what's referred to as liquefaction. The gravel and the sand just starts to shake and it can slide. And the most famous occurrence that we have of that, at least within the United States, is the town, I hesitate to say the city, the town of Valdez, Alaska, back during the 1964 earthquake, but basically the whole town just slid right into the bay. So the National Park Service reached out to quite a number of different organizations to say, hey, we got to look at what happened. What was the results of this earthquake? What are the things that we have to start monitoring that maybe we weren't thinking about before? So they called us and they said, can you guys come down here and help us out, do some leveling? So I put together a plan. One of the problems that we'd had, and you'll see this in a few minutes, the National Geodetic Survey and our predecessor agency, the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, we've run levels into the Washington Monument since 1884. We have something like 16 or 17 different leveling campaigns going in and out of the Washington Monument. The problem is that most of those campaigns that we've conducted over those years were never so large that they encompassed a fairly significant area beyond just the National Mall. So when we start looking at issues of subsidence or settling in an area that's particularly, fill, we need to have data from stations, from benchmarks that are outside of that area. And regrettably, many of the surveys that have been conducted were never that extensive. We have a few that were, and fortunately they contribute to a lot of this, but when we sat down and I looked at this, I said, if I'm going to do this, we're going to do this at National Geodetic Survey. We're going to make sure that we're putting in a baseline survey that we will be able to work on from here on out. And we're in the process now of putting together an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with National Park Service. For about every 3 years, National Geodetic Survey will go down and re-level this whole thing so we can monitor it. Well, what came out of the design, that you'll see in a moment, I put together a plan that was roughly about 30 kilometers of double run, that means out and back, first order class 2 leveling, 62 benchmarks. And you'll see the area here in a moment. I mean, we have a lot of control in this area, a lot of stations, but many of them have only been hit once or twice, even though many of them are 50, 60 years old. So we wanted to make sure we included everything that we knew was around. I know this is a little hard to see, particularly if you're sitting in the back, but this is a piece of an article that was put together by the U.S. Geological Survey back in 1950, which studies the bedrock surface. Now, what you're seeing here, the center of this is the Washington Monument, and these are some test bores that they ran looking to find out exactly where bedrock is under the Washington Monument. Remember, the Washington Monument weighs 81,000 tons, all right? This is a big structure, and it's sitting on a lot of fill. And again, I realize you can't see all this if you're sitting in the back, but I've excerpted a few things. The foundation lies on sand and gravel about 65 feet above bedrock floor, and most of that from these 15 test bores that they did is gravel, sand, and blue clay. And many of you are very familiar with those types of structures, so you know it can be rather unstable. And so it's not sitting on bedrock. Even the foundation is not sitting on bedrock. The foundation is very stable on the Washington Monument, but it does not sit on bedrock. It sits on this gravel and sand and clay, so it does bring cause for concern. Now, one of the things that they did, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of the history of the Washington Monument. I mean, it was originally put together by a group of folks who were very well intended, and they only built about half of it. And then after the Civil War, the federal government took over the responsibility of completing the monument. And the responsibility ended up with this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Casey. Well, as part of Casey's effort, he was a civil engineer, and we don't hold that against him, of course, but part of Casey's, one of the things he did is he established a primary benchmark from which he would monitor settling of the refoundation, because they actually went in and they dug this huge area out around the Washington Monument and put in a whole new foundation. It's a wonderful piece of work that they did. But there's this very special benchmark that they established, and I know it's a little difficult to see, and you're going to see some pictures of it here in a moment. Only a small handful of people have ever even seen this monument. Alan, you've seen it. Alan knows where it is. If you go down to the Washington Monument, well, you see the picture here in a minute, you'll at least see where it is. But this monument, it's often referred to as the mini monument because it looks just like the Washington Monument, except it's got a flat top on it so you can put a level rod on it. Casey built this monument. It's 12.5 feet deep, and then it's teed at the bottom, and this bottom piece is about 10 feet wide. So it's a pretty considerable structure, and he would level from that almost every day up to the monument itself during the course of the construction effort, and that goes back to 1879. Fortunately, that monument is still there. Now we have access to Casey's original notes, but what we don't know is exactly what type of level he used. We believe it was more like a dumpy level, and certainly wasn't of geodetic quality, so we can't really compare what he was doing back then. However, we've done a tremendous amount of work at this mark. This one mark, is the mark that really everybody relates to the Washington Monument. Well, that's nice, except that this mark is only about 120 feet south of the monument. This is north, all right? So the White House is that way, the Capitol's back out this way, all right? So 120 feet south of the Washington Monument is this very special benchmark. And here you see kind of a picture of it. So you're looking north here. That's the cap of the Washington Monument. The White House is up there, and here you can barely see it here, but that's the area where this monument exists. There's a cover on it. Of course, the cover doesn't say anything. It's just just this big cast iron cover, weighs a ton, and there's the monument. Right? Now, I got to tell you, this is kind of funny. It was funny for me anyway. To get access to this, you've got to work with the National Park Service, and you need to know the secret handshake, right? And that, of course, that was really part of this whole thing. We were obviously working directly with the National Park Service, so we had pretty much open access to this. So we go up to, the day we're going to level into this mark. You can see it's got a nice flat top on it, and we yanked that cover off. Well, it's just out in the middle of everywhere, and the public is just walking up and down. And most people kind of walk by and they look at it and go, okay, whatever, no big deal. This one couple walks up. Turns out the guy's a surveyor from Texas. And, yeah, so it was pretty cool. So he was a surveyor, he understood, so he was pretty glad to be able to see that. And that's a very unique monument. It's still there. And of course, we use this as the primary mark. But one of the conditions we had to look at, that I've had to look at, for a number of years is, okay, if we think the Washington Monument is moving, what is this monument doing? Do we know what this monument, what kind of conditions it's undergoing? Because that's a part of it. All the leveling goes from this monument up to the Washington Monument, and so what's going? We call it benchmark A, but we generically refer to it as the mini monument. So here's part of the problem. The Washington Monument, over the course of a number of years, and I think everybody can appreciate this, and you'll see my graph, or my Excel spreadsheet here in a moment. We've been doing leveling, like I said, at the monument since 1884. Well, go figure, almost all the monuments that we've set there, all the benchmarks we've set there have been disturbed or destroyed. Duh, So we go in and, I'm sorry?
A Texas survey.
Texas survey, yeah. So we go into the monument in 1884. We've got some benchmarks. We level to those 1884 and 1901 and 1907 and 1912, and then all those marks get destroyed, right? And then we come back and we put another benchmark in 1923 or 22, I forget what it is. And okay, and then we level that for about 5 or 6 times, and somewhere around 1975, 76, that mark gets destroyed. And of course, nobody ever calls us up and says, hey, we're going to do it. We just go down there one day and we find the mark's gone. So dealing with conventional marks, as most of us are familiar with, the brass disc, brass, bronze, or aluminum disc, this is driving us crazy at this place. You've got to have a stable platform to go back to. So in 1984, we created a very special benchmark that we use for the monuments in the city of Washington, and here you see a picture of it. And I've got one here in my bag. Hang on. Somewhere. So what we did, since people like to rip out a disc, we said that's not a good thing. So we created